Hello, everybody. Welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the fireside chat, but typically I am the one that does the talking on those shows and hosts them. But I'm basically going to be behaving as, I guess, just like a kind of moderator. I'm also going to be taking a little bit of the pressure off of Prim by basically looking at and responding to the chat if need be, as well as reading your super chats. So I'm basically just facilitating today's discussion. I am here with Prim Reaper, as you guys know, as well as progressive streamer Rose Wrist. You are a progressive streamer and content creator that specializes in debate and research, or at least has a special interest in it. I have put all of your social media things, mainly your YouTube channel, your Twitter, and your website down below. If there's something else that you also want me to share with the audience, just drop it in the Discord chat room right here, like in our little chat, and I'll put that in there as well. So welcome to the show, Wrist.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the links that you've already provided are more than enough, and I thank you very much for it.
So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna basically back off, and I'm only gonna come in if if things get a little chaotic or people start talking over each other, because Discord does this thing where if you guys are talking over each other, nobody can understand what anyone is saying. So we want to make sure that we keep things as clear as possible. And unless there's something else you need me for, I'm just gonna mute myself and shut up.
Okay. All right. Sounds fair. So if it's cool, I'm just going to start by saying, hey, in the last live stream, I got a little emotional and said some things that I regret. And, it was unbecoming. And I just want to say publicly, because I've already said it privately, that I apologize about that. And the way I responded in my personal videos was more the way that I wanted to respond, joking, but not being a dick about it. So sorry for accidentally being a dick about it in the last one. Like I said, my emotions got ahead of me.
Yeah, no worries. I appreciate the apology, and I have a few things I'm going to get to as well in my opening. But do you want to begin, and then I'll begin, and then we can move into open discussion?
Well, basically, this whole thing was you asked to kind of chat about everything at the end of your last video. I had initially responded in my own videos, but I felt like it would probably wind up being better to clear the air publicly, just for everybody to see. Quite honestly, like based on a lot of your actual responses to things and your descriptions of things, I really don't actually think there's like a wide gulf between our views. I think that a lot of what was going on there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of miscommunication. I don't even really know how to properly explain it. Like, having been in psychology for some time now, I've kind of developed a bit of an understanding of both sides, like a social justice perspective. Obviously had to study that a lot in my education, but also the perspective from a lot of other people where they're finding that, their voices really aren't being heard from that perspective. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's kind of exploring that other side that doesn't seem to get quite as much attention. So that's basically a general introduction.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, sounds good. So I much more appreciated the formal responses you made in the videos to that live stream. Obviously, there were some jokes you made in the videos that admittedly were pretty funny. I did have a bit of a chuckle at that. And also, your art is good, okay? I yelled at my chat for it in the original thing. I disagreed with them, and I know you pointed out in the video, so I just want to say it again, okay? The art is good. Now...
Thank you.
No worries. The key thing, or like the biggest sort of underlying thing in this, entire conversation we've had back and forth, really mostly just stems down to one thing, because there's like one simple, maybe like retitling or just like slight different framing of your original videos that if that had been done, I would have had not enough issues with that at all to even bother going over it. And that is the sort of difference between describing the insidious aspects of social justice versus, for example, insidious representatives. Had it been from more of the latter perspective, I would probably have found it to be a really good video, and it's something that I also personally do a lot. I really, really strongly, have a dislike and think that people are doing active harm who poorly represent what are, in my opinion, really good ideas. And had that been the general framing of the overall sort of video and the ideas you were laying out, I probably wouldn't have had enough issues that we would have been, having this conversation right now.
Yeah.
On top of that, there were a few more things. One of the recurring points I hear that is brought up again is how I over-explain things and how this can be perceived as condescending, which I perfectly understand. And this is something I often talk about on stream, but obviously I don't expect everybody to be aware of this. But when I talk about things in videos or in discussions or when I go over things, I don't necessarily directly speak and work with on from a one-on-one perspective with the person I'm going over. I'm also in large part explaining so much to the audience that I'm very confident that the person whose video I'm actually reacting to is, very well aware of, because obviously I want the viewer to be engaged with it and to be able to learn as much possible from the actual thing I'm going over. So that's one of the important things that I want to clarify as well. There's also one specific thing which I will admit I was totally incorrect about, which was at one point in your video, the segment about the progressively smaller earnings gap. I misunderstood that sentence completely. For the rest, I think there's more things to hash out. But with that, I completely misunderstood that sentence. So just want to put that out there as well. But overall,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. But overall, I've gone over the majority of the topics, and I think a good place to start, and the place that I think we could probably agree with a lot and fairly quickly, would be the discussion surrounding toxic masculinity. I think that could be a good starting point, because I don't think we disagree too much on that one. Yeah.
Sure. But first, just to kind of address the first thing that you said, because I actually think that that's a really interesting point of discussion, kind of, is that, see, for me, I think the insidious aspects word choice was that I think it's basically about the way that certain people are taking this kind of overall theory and running with it, basically. So as ultimately, I think I pretty much agree with you that there are just mostly bad actors that are kind of taking this thing and running with it. One thing that I have been saying a lot more lately is that I really think that with almost any of these theories, actually, I think that most people are coming at it from a place of wanting to help others. So I really try as much as possible to not focus on the negatives, because I have this optimistic viewpoint of people that most people just want to try and make the world a better place for as many people as possible. So, but I think that nevertheless, there are some people that can take what should be a positive message and kind of take it and run with it the wrong way, and they twist it into this negative thing that winds up turning into blame and shame and things like that, right? So that's kind of been what this whole series has been focusing on, and I'm going to be getting back to it after all this. I have seen the ways that it can kind of be twisted into a negative thing, and I think that that's a real shame. I've had people thank me for my social justice, and I'll admit that back before, it used to kind of bristle me a little bit. But then, as I've gotten older and thought about it more, it's no, that's really, it's not that far off from what I'm doing. It's just from a different perspective, with focusing with a different group of people, right? So that's why I try to say, I don't think that the whole idea of it is garbage and needs to be put in the bin. We should never use it again. It's just the people that are kind of twisting it into these negative ways to kind of be cruel to people, be dismissive of other people's perspectives, things like that. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of address that one part, because I think that we're really not that far off on it.
Yeah,
It's just a wording choice.
I
But
agree
yeah,
with you,
kind of.
Rosen, with
Okay.
that specifically. I think it's, for me personally, it's a pet peeve of mine, because if if you aren't super really sort of meticulous and trying as much as possible to separate representatives from ideas, then you could practically, in a lot of ways, at least in the minds of, certain people in the audience, discredit practically any form of, generally common idea or framework in society, because you can very easily find enough poor examples of basically anything implemented, and then through, not necessarily intentional, but through awkward framing, that can reflect, at least in the minds of the audience, on the whole idea, So, for instance, you can even do this with something as, as easy as math, for instance, and take examples of people making flaws in engineering that killed, many people, and doing incorrect with math, and then just talking about those specific examples and casting shade on the entire field of mathematics. And that's really what I really want to avoid, because I think that the idea of intersectionality and of social justice is a phenomenal one, and is one that, can, if applied properly, can solve very many ailments that we have generally in society. And I'm just worried that through the framing that you had in your original video, a lot of the people that may be viewing that video might have gotten the negative impression of the actual idea, the clinical version, the pure version of it, rather than getting an idea of criticizing, its worst representatives.
Yeah, I think too, it's a lot of excuse me, the people who are viewing my video are likely going to be the ones that have kind of experienced it from the negative side, that's not the pure side, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, because I've
Can
just
I'm sorry, can I just ask a question? I just want to clarify. What do you mean by the pure side? What does that mean? Is that just like it as it is intended, or it as it actually plays out in the real world?
I think it's hard to ascribe intention to a specific academic school of thought, but if you take more of the hard academic, from the existing literature on the topic, and that form of sort of clinical understanding of it, that's what I'm interested in defending. When I talk about the pure version of it, I'm obviously not talking about the representatives, because I think we need to divorce ideas and the merits of the ideas from the quality of the representative. So I'm very much interested in preserving the idea and defending the idea and the core concepts of social justice, which I think is very defensible, and divorcing that as much as possible and critiquing the worst representatives so they can get better at representing it in an accurate way and in a way that has just better effect on society as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's kind of how I'm taking what you're saying as well. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for me to provide examples in my field, because so much of what I do, there's that very strict confidentiality requirement, right? So I would like to be able to kind of provide examples, but it's a bit tricky. So forgive me if I have to be a bit fiddly with this. But for example, I had to take a class that was essentially like a social justice, multicultural based course in this whole thing, in order to kind of develop a perspective in that for my master's degree. And one of the assignments was actually like a cultural interview kind of thing, where we were meant to interview somebody from a culture different from our own, do research prior to completing the interview, and then write an essay on that. And I did do an interview with one of my Muslim coworkers. I love her. She's one of the sweetest people. And essentially, I did a bunch of research on it that was talking about, Muslim women's experiences in Western cultures and things like that. And primarily the research that I was encountering was talking about, negative experiences, oppression, things like that. But when I actually spoke, when I performed the interview with my coworker, there was very little of that. It was very much, I have found this to be a positive thing in my experience. It has helped me to kind of gain in my education and my career. So it was kind of an interesting chance to talk with people in my class about, how if we go into talking to people with assumptions about their experiences, then, we can wind up kind of going into things with a bias, right? Like one of the articles that I linked in one of my videos was a teacher's perspective, who said that, social justice theory can actually wind up leading to people going into the counseling room with a client having biases automatically ingrained, right? Which can kind of lead nicely into the toxic masculinity discussion, if you would like to kind of jump into that now.
Yeah, sure. I just touch on that just a little bit before we do that. Yeah, I agree with 100%. No matter what sort of framework or lens from which we analyze, like an individual's experience, there's going to be some degree of bias, right? Whether even if you're going with a very strict, as diametrically opposed from social justice as you can, or social justice, there's going to be some level of bias. The argument that I would sort of make is that typically an intersectional, a social justice oriented analysis is more likely than existing alternatives to be able to have the highest possible degree of accuracy when it comes to predicting these things. So I recognize 100% that any form of like overall lens or framework is going to have, like gaps between aggregates and individuals 100%, but there is still value in having sort of an understanding of the mean experience of certain groups of people, most specifically in order to draw policies and take strong actions, and not necessarily in, like understanding an individual's experience. But I understand what you said. I would just like make the argument that it's, it's relative to the alternatives in that regard, and the positives and negatives of those. But yeah, we can talk about toxic masculinity for a second then. One of the things that was talked about often by you is the label of toxic masculinity, and how the word itself is very negative, has a negative connotation to it, and it shouldn't be used. So I have just one simple question on that topic. Is your only issue with toxic masculinity the label of it, or is there like a stronger underlying disagreement with what it's getting at, or the concept or its definition?
Well, I mean, okay, so I kind of tried to go over this in my response video, but for the people who haven't watched that, I'll go over it kind of again. I think that labeling a cluster of behaviors as kind of inherent to masculinity, it's oversimplifying things, and it's also going in the wrong direction, I think. Now, masculinity, as a whole, as the whole concept of masculinity, it refers kind of to behaviors and things that we associate with men, right? Whereas femininity goes with women. So kind of taking a subsection of behaviors and calling them toxic masculinity, it's almost like it basically says this is a subset within this cluster of behaviors that is negative, that you have to kind of be aware of, because it's more likely to be happening within you than it is in the other side. But I think that that's kind of, it's an oversimplification. It's not true, honestly. Like there are behaviors that can be displayed by both men and women that are being ascribed to, a toxic masculinity framework. And I think that in doing that, we are basically putting forth the message of, like shame, like this is something that is within you. This is more within men than it is within women. And you can see that when you look at research like the one that I cited before, where a lot of people are looking at this and they are experiencing that as being personal shame, right? Now, whether that's intended or not, that's again fine. Like we were saying before, sometimes when people come up with a concept in an academic sense, they're not really intending to do that. In fact, I would say they're probably usually not intending to do that. But the fact of the matter is that's the way a lot of people are experiencing it. And one example that I gave in my video was there is a psychological technique called externalizing. And what that means is, like, we take a behavior that somebody is experiencing and we kind of essentially move it aside from them, say like, you are not your anxiety, right? So then it becomes, we are able to disentangle it from a person's being and make it a separate behavior that they can then focus. And it's often easier for them to kind of target that and work towards improvement. And it feels almost like the term toxic masculinity is like the opposite of that. It's like, this is a behavior that is within yourself that you have to deal with, you have to manage. And I feel like a lot of men are experiencing it that way, as you can see with the kinds of responses that this kind of term gets, right? So that's kind of a broad summary of how I feel about it.
Yeah, there's absolutely some things I want to talk about with the label specifically, and how it's how it's received. But before that, there were a few things you mentioned there specifically. But you would agree then, because you seem to imply that, okay, these are behaviors that are, you know, also available on the other side of the spectrum, for instance. And while I agree with that, that's absolutely a type of behavior that is, you know, prevalent on the other side, it's not quite as common, nor is it as socially reinforced as certain behaviors which are specifically ascribed to you on the basis of, you know, like being ascribed masculinity in society. So for instance, the sort of like repression of emotion is something that, at least, you know, from my understanding, is something that men are sort of socialized into at a much higher degree and to a much greater extent than what women are. So while I agree that repression of emotion is something that is faced by all genders, I think that there is some special pressures that men face specifically in the prevalence of those types of behaviors developing within them. And that's why I think there is still some form of value to being able to distinguish between traits that are commonly socially, you know, ascribed to women as compared to men. I think there is such a thing as toxic femininity as well. I think there are obviously both sides of the spectrum. But I think that there's still value in ascribing the differences there and understanding them in order to be able to address them in a much better perspective. And then to another thing you said, which is the fact that the label itself and the concept seems to blame an individual, that is something inherent about them. And I agree with you. If you're not using an intersectional analysis, that is absolutely the impression you might get. However, through a more like social justice oriented intersectional analysis, masculinity is less something that, you know, arises from you inherently in your very being, and less so than it is something that is ascribed to you by society. It's a set of pressures and social cues that society influences you into internalizing. And if you look at it from that perspective, it no longer becomes, okay, these people are saying that there is something inherently toxic about me, as much as it becomes, these people are saying that society is ascribing and influencing me in these harmful ways. And it's a lot more sympathetic perspective than the former one, right? And it's something that I feel like a lot more people would agree with specifically. But now we're also bordering on the actual label, which I want to talk about a bit later. But before that, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond.
Okay, well, and see, I think it's all a matter of like what the intention is versus how it comes across.
Mhm.
Like I think when you look at the original intention, and what I said in my toxic masculinity video, you know, was that it was originally created by the mythopoetic men's group, right? Like
Mhm.
that wasn't me trying to dismiss that. That was me saying like that is what happened, and the original intention was to kind of distinguish like these toxic behaviors that arise from like healthy masculinity. So it was something that was originally created in a men's group, for men. So you know, you can't say that it was coming from a negative perspective of men. In fact, it was just the opposite. But I think it's the problem is the way a lot of people kind of use it in sort of this shaming mode, right? Like you can look at the APA guidelines for men and boys that came out a couple of years back, and it reads very, very differently from the way the APA guidelines on women and girls reads, right? Like there's a lot more focus on the internal and behaviors inherent to men and masculinity, whereas the guidelines on women and girls are a lot more focused on external pressures that may be impacting women and girls' behavior, right? So it kind of like ultimately in practice, it winds up coming across as, you know, just a very different kind of focus. And I think that, you know, the way that people experience this thing is really important. And so like I think like if we have a significant subset of people who are saying, you know, no, this is not really accurately describing my experiences, you know, even if people are socialized into a set of behaviors, and there might be lots of different pressures kind of influencing that, some positive, some negative. Um, you know, if a lot of people are saying that this isn't really working for me, then, you know, what I am automatically drawn to do as like a psychologist is to be like, okay, well, I want to work within your framework, right? I want to work in a way that respects what you want. Otherwise, I'm not really focused on your care, right? So that's kind of generally where I'm coming from when I challenge it. I see the fact that people don't like it. I see the way it's coming across for a lot of people, and that's that's where I'm focused on, right?
Yeah, and I can agree with what you said. Like, there is sort of, it's generally more common for issues that women face to be externalized and issues that men face to be like internalized, to be blamed on the men specifically inherently. And I agree with this 100%. Now, the key question to this is, okay, what is the solution? What is the improvement to this poor framing of things? And in my opinion, the improvement of it is to treat men's issues like we treat, for the most part, women's issues today in society, right? We look at it from a more of a proper perspective. We look at it from a non-oppressor, oppressive, or non-oppressor, oppressed perspective. Not, it's your fault, it's you inherently. It's things that society conditions us towards doing. And in my opinion, that is the very essence of intersectionality, right? That is the essence of social justice. So that's the key thing I run into, that a lot of these issues, which you very rightly identify, the solution to that, in my opinion, is actual well-practiced intersectionality rather than alternatives, which there are many of, and which would be, in my opinion, worse for the most part. Do you disagree with what I just said?
Not in practice. I mean, basically, the way I would describe it as I resist a little bit leaning into things that kind of focus too much on categories. So like I agree with the fact that intersectionality can really allow us to look at people's lives in a really rich and complex way if it's used properly, if it's used in the proper academic sense, right? But I think that, we have to be a little bit careful with how certain people are going to interpret it. So like, say, for example, maybe in classes where this is taught, the teacher could be very careful to say, this is not to say that everybody who is in this category is going to experience things this way. And we really have to resist treating people as though they have like de facto
They're monolith, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like privilege and power just because they belong to a certain category. And that, I think, is going to go a long way towards challenging the ideas that many people are developing, that certain groups of people have privilege and certain groups of people have oppression, which I really don't think is an accurate reflection of reality. Like, for example, I think a large portion of it is like who has the most money, that person is the most privileged. And I don't mean to sound like I'm dismissing dismissing that idea out of hand, but I do think that is a significant key factor that really impacts a person's life. Even as you say, focusing on wealth is an intersectional aspect, right? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, like with everything you just identified, I would just keep saying that the key solution is proper in-depth intersectionality, right? Not oppressor, more like, okay, generally, I know somebody in chat pointed this out before. They're like, oh, take a shot every time he says aggregate, but on the aggregate, these people from these group of people are people from this general social group are more likely to experience this and less likely to experience this, and Now, obviously, this is not super concrete. These are less, sort of 100% concrete predictors of your life experience, so much as they are like modifiers that might increase or decrease the likelihood of certain events transpiring, right? And yeah, like I would say, this is the very essence of intersectionality, and this is why I'm 100% on board with criticizing poor representatives and poor practices of it, and more in favor rather than criticizing the actual idea as a whole. And if you think about it from, if I take it back to like the example of like maths, for instance, maybe one of the reasons why we societally don't have, like these large condemnations of like maths or, like biology or chemistry, or maybe like economics, for instance. Economics is a better example because it's also social science. The reason why we don't see the same degree of contempt being directed towards those as we do social justice, and also the reason why there's generally less poor representatives of maybe economic theory than there might be social justice, is because we teach more about economics, just generally in society, in school. It's a class you can take, even as low as like high school, like middle school. There isn't really like, intersectionality or that type of like complex and intricate and very nuanced education on a topic which is admittedly as complicated as intersectionality. And then as a result of sort of like the mismatch there in the education on, intersectionality as like a social framework and certain like economic frameworks, you're going to get worse representatives of, intersectionality as relative to representatives of, for example, economics. So the solution, from my perspective, is at least to do more like in-depth, proper intersectionality, educate people more on this proper, version of intersectionality, not like the, team building activities, one step back, two steps forward that you talked about in your video. And therefore, we're going to have more, proper practices and less poor representatives. And we can build a healthier opinion generally about social justice as a topic, because I'm fairly certain that if I, for example, asked like members of like the Badger chat right now, what is your opinion of social justice as an idea? A lot of that is going to be very, very tainted by the representatives. And a lot of, more people are going to have negative ideas of the idea as a whole for reasons not inherent to the idea, but rather the representatives. But yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's probably a fair assessment. Because like I think for a lot of us, if this stuff like played out in practice, like it as the original intention was, then it would be delightful, because that would mean that we would be giving attention to people who needed it, regardless of the categories they belong to, right? So we wouldn't be saying to a poor white homeless man on the street, like, well, you're white, so you have an element of privilege to your life, right? So we would be avoiding silliness like that. We would be avoiding overgeneralizations, like men are coming from men have more power and women have less power. Like I haven't experienced my life that way in the slightest, and I actually find it kind of demoralizing and I don't know, just wrong in general to even look at my life through that lens. I prefer to just look at it through like differences. So kind of just returning back to what we were saying before, I really think that it's we have to be careful to kind of when we're using broad categories, we have to be careful to be accepting of differences and not like hand wave them away as just anecdotes. It's like, well, this is more complex than that. We can use this way, but we have to always be open to the fact that everybody will have individual experiences that are challenging that. And also to kind of answer your previous question from before that kind of never got answered about how would we do it better with the toxic masculinity thing. I had mentioned in my videos that I think that there is a simple framing change that we could do to kind of remove that shaming element. And it was basically, when talking to men about like behaviors that might be giving them difficulty, if we really want to stick with the the toxic masculinity terminology, which I'm still a little iffy on to begin with, but if we frame it as like men may be more likely to display these problem behaviors than women, versus these are behaviors that are like inherent to like the masculine identity, then it does that externalizing thing that I was talking about before, right? It treats it as a behavior that they might be having, rather than this is a part of you. It's kind of like the difference in like one example that was studied in my class, my social justice intersectionality course, was the difference between using disabled person versus person with a disability, right? Because it's like it's not a part of them, it's something that this person has, that they are experiencing, that they are dealing with, right? It's just a matter of kind of having that respect and care across the board, basically.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with you 100%. So wouldn't you say then that reframing, that transition from moving like the blame and the general like negative feelings away from the individual and towards more societal pressures and societal interpretations, wouldn't that sort of by definition be a more intersectional way of looking at these things?
Well, it's not even necessarily like the societal thing. Like it's I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. It's basically just focusing on like the specific behavior rather than on like pressures and things like that, right? So it's like, for example, if we want to focus on like a like societal pressure on men towards not expressing emotions as openly, right? So if I were to have like two different men in the room, different rooms that I was talking to, and one of them said, you know, this is causing problems in my relationship, and I really want help to get over it. Then, you know, you would treat that very differently as a man who said, you know, I feel like whenever I express my emotions, people just ridicule and laugh at me and dismiss me, right? Like those are two people who are experiencing very different kinds of problems, even though it's basically the same cluster of behaviors, right? So it's like this person feels like he's protecting himself then by not expressing his emotions because doing so in the past has caused him to be hurt. Whereas this person is, you know, experiencing it negatively because it's harming his relationship with his partner. So it's like focusing on a behavior and kind of saying, okay, well, repressing your emotions, this is toxic masculinity. You know, it's like it's an oversimplification. It's not really accounting for individual situations. So like societal pressures may be causing one thing, may be causing something, but you know, it's important that we focus not on like society and what society is doing, but on the behavior and what that is, how that is impacting individuals' lives. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from, like as a counselor. You might be coming at it from a different perspective as an academic. So it's
That's
I'll let
very
you talk now.
charitable of you to say. But yeah, so I think that I agree with what you just said. I just want to take it maybe like one step further. So wouldn't it be necessary then to understand where this behavior and where the root cause of this behavior might be? And if you sort of understand that more and you follow that sort of, you know, like pathing, you eventually you get back into society, right? Because you and I agree, right? There's nothing inherent about men preventing them from, you know, expressing emotions, being, you know, like emotionally open and yeah, any number of things that you already understand. And that's sort of, you know, from the larger perspective, intersectionality isn't necessarily supposed to explain an individual experience as much as it's just supposed to sort of detect larger inequities within society and sort of find, okay, is there anything we can do about this? How can we do this? Is it education? Is it this policy? Is it da, 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 da? So people who like look at individuals and like, okay, you're here because you feel this and this and this group, and that's it. Like end of story here. Of course, that's missing the picture, and that's a you know, appropriation, misuse of intersectionality as a framing, right? But yeah, if we followed the core cause of this behavior down a little bit, I think we would end back up at society, right? So I don't necessarily agree with the separation or the dichotomy between society and behavior. I think those are not things that need to be dichotomized.
Well, I suppose if you think about it one way, like there's almost there could be almost two different societal pressures on both of these examples, right? Like one of them is feeling the societal pressure to, you know, close up and not share their emotions because they're being made fun of for doing that. Whereas the other one could have just been raised, you know, like, I don't know, maybe they were raised by like a strong, tough mother and father figures that were like, yeah, we're not really very emotional in this house, right? Like I have a friend who was very much like that, and they grew up the same way, and it was actually a woman, so that's kind of funny. But yeah, it's just saying like there could be these very different kind of pressures. And I mean, again, I guess if we want to go like up and up and up the chain of things, we could say there's different reasons for why that happens. But I guess it's just the point where it becomes, you know, a little bit more ephemeral and things like that, and you know, where some people start to lose their way and start doing intersectionality wrong. I guess we both kind of got on that point in our discussions. So
yeah, I suppose.
Can I butt in for a second? Can I butt in for a second?
Sure.
I want to ask a question. What do you mean by society? This word gets tossed around a lot. Our modern society is made up of human beings, and most of them are men and women. And when men feel pressure from society, I would like to know specifically where it comes from. Is it from men? Is it from women? Is it from both? Is it from their mothers? Is it from their fathers? Please expand on it, because the blanket term society is not terribly useful to a lot of people.
Yeah, 100%. So, it is none of the groups you know like mentioned previously. It is not an individual that is at fault. I actually talked about this very recently, right? And people dismissing men's structures because men invented the patriarchy, whatever that means, is an argument that I take issue with, and I explained why I took issue with it before. But it's not at all the fault of an individual or a group of individuals or like a social group why, you know, what society is or why society does certain things. It is a very, very, very complex, right? That's $1 million question, right? Within the entirety of social sciences, what exactly is society? But we can very broadly say that society is a culmination or a combination of culture, of economic structures, of governance, of, you know, the laws that exist in place, of yeah, like customs and traditions, of maybe geography to some extent, of just these wide range of different factors which, while a very core aspect long ago may have been formed by an individual, it is now so far abstracted from that specific individual or that specific social group that at this point it's more become entrenched and interweaved with the social structures and the culture we engage with rather than actual individuals. So it's a very difficult question to answer, like what exactly is society? But the key takeaways is that there is nobody that is to blame, no individual social group that is to blame for, you know, toxic masculinity or any other, you know, social ailments. It's a highly complicated matter that has to do with, yeah, like all the things I mentioned before, history and all the different moving parts in society to make sort of a, yeah, very complicated weave of structures that we define in society. Um, did you want to answer that question as well, Prim, or was that directed towards me?
No, I think that that's roughly how I interpret it, is kind of like the broad general whole of the world around us, basically. Because like any one person is going to be experiencing things, you know, from their mother or father, assuming both of those are in their lives, their friends, their schools. There's actually a whole large circle of influence that we kind of studied in. I took a family therapy course, and it's like the circles kind of interlap, and there's multiple different things, and that's kind of the way I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, there's all those different kinds of influences on people, but um, yeah, I guess the only thing that we seem to be, and I even hesitate to call it a disagreement because it doesn't really feel that way. It's just like, where do we kind of focus on like the societal versus the individual, and how far back do we go, like where our focus is. And, you know, maybe like just from our perspectives, we're just automatically going to be going in different ways with that. Like as a counselor who's planning to work with individuals, maybe my focus will be primarily on the individual or on those close to them. Whereas like if you're planning to, you know, I don't know what you're planning to do, but like if you're focusing on this from a more academic lens, then maybe, you know, you want to be out there in that more broad, like larger framed lens, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I agree with you 100%, is that we're very much coming at this from different perspectives, right? Because you're never going to give the same advice to an individual as you're going to do when you draft policy or talk like large scale, right? So for instance, let's say that there is an, you know, like an like a problem with society with like people not being able to get employed, like specifically not there being a lack of jobs, but just people having difficulty with employment. Now, societally, if I'm drafting a policy, it would be a very stupid thing of me to say, we need to have programs and speakers in the public courts telling people to dress better for interviews, right? That's going to be very non-applicable, very broad, not going to have really a strong effect on the specific outcomes in a specific, you know, instance. But if a friend comes to me and is like, hey, I'm having trouble finding a job, what can I do? That's when I give them that piece of advice, because for them individually, that can be very, very useful, and it's specialized, and I know their given situation sort of, and that can have positive effects. So I agree with you 100% that there's a very strong difference between the type of advice we give individuals and the type of understanding and the type of prescriptions we want to make on a societal level. I agree with that. We could wrap up this topic with toxic masculinity a little bit, and then we could get to some of the other topics where we might have a little bit more of a divide. But yeah, the last thing I want to say on toxic masculinity is that At this point, it is very much true that the word toxic masculinity, I haven't specifically looked at the study you like to reference about their understanding and their reception, but I'm going to take it for granted during this discussion. It could very much be the case that the term toxic masculinity at this point has been, I want to say misunderstood, but just generally, yeah, like misunderstood, and it has like this negative connotation, and it's talked about in a negative way in a lot of spacers. That word may be unsalvageable, and at this point, there's too much like cultural baggage to this term that it doesn't serve the purpose we want it to serve. And if that's the case, sure, we can move on. It's something I've mentioned before as well. If things like the patriarchy and toxic masculinity wasn't called the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, so many more people would be on board with it. So yeah, sure, I agree with you that maybe like the term is beyond reach. But I think there's also an interesting discussion to be had about if it's just the actual etymological makeup of the word that has made people have such a negative opinion towards it, or if there are like strong effects or sort of pressures from the way people speak about it without really being super informed on what it means, which might not always be to their faults, but sometimes I could say that it could be intentional to some regard, because there are individuals, very like traditionalist individuals, that very much want to completely separate any of the negative aspects and want us to act in highly gender dichotomous manners for whatever reason. But I think that's like sort of separate discussion to add. I don't think we would disagree too much on that, but that's just like an extra piece of analysis I wanted to add there.
Just a very brief addition on the end there. I think like if we want to go the societal individual lens really quickly, we can also say that it's possible that the societal views around the toxic masculinity, patriarchy, all those kinds of terms have therefore gone down to influence the individuals who use them wrong, and for whatever way they have taken these societal pressures in the wrong way and are therefore using the terms in a negative way to judge others. So it can kind of go both ways, right? It's not necessarily about like men exhibiting behaviors that certain people perceive as toxic, but those pressures are also on the people who are saying that these behaviors are toxic, right? So it's all very complicated. And
there's another parallel you could draw to this. It's not exactly the same, obviously there's some difference, but I think it's comparable enough. If you take, like, for example, the term price discrimination, which is an economic term, right? Discrimination, wow, this is a very negatively loaded word, right? Obviously people who engage in this practice must be doing something terribly wrong, right? Well, that's not really at all the case. And when we look at price discrimination on the basis of maybe like age for certain products, ends up with more people being able to afford the product, or based on timing, it makes it easier for companies to, for example, like run their business and just generally just have an easier time logistically. And that's sort of like a parallel there. That's another word that has maybe like a highly negative etymological meaning, right? You don't want to be, assuming you didn't know what the term meant, you don't want to be accused of price discrimination, because the word discrimination is a very heavy, negative leaning. But you don't see the typical like outrage or disagreement with the word inherently that you might see for example, toxic masculinity. And they're not entirely comparable because price is less divorced from an individual's human experience than what masculinity may be for many other people. But I still think that there's an interesting aspect to be had here, and I could probably imagine a world in which there are plenty of maybe very inefficient SJWs that freak out over the word price discrimination, and at that point find it to be too bad of a word to use. So that's just like an example I suppose you could use there. But yeah, the next
all
thing,
right.
No, before we move away from toxic masculinity, I want to ask a question of both of you guys. What is a positive, non-toxic masculine trait that is more prevalent, if not unique, to men?
I'm sure you're going to know so much more about this than I do, so I'm going to go first so that you don't strip all the material away from me.
Oh, no, hold on. But why do you think you don't know the answer to that question?
Well, it's not so much I don't know the answer. I think we can both answer it to an acceptable degree, but obviously Prim has education on the topic, so I'm sure she can list plenty of examples that I may not have thought about. But one good example of that could be, for example, confidence. I think confidence is generally something that is a lot more, at least, like overt, like social confidence is something that is a lot more common among men. And I think it's largely a product of like masculine pressures, and I think it's a positive trait, and it's a trait that should be encouraged across, you know, the entire gender spectrum.
Okay, quick. I want to just add to that really quick. Confidence has been described as a product of toxic masculinity, and secondly, I
Overconfidence, that would
believe, and
be.
I'm just gonna. Well, but then how do you know when confidence ends and overconfidence begins?
Well, it's
I think that the line is a little bit hard to see, but to add to this too, it's not men that reinforce confidence as a positive trait, it's women. And most of what men do, they do because they're trying to attract women. And this is something that I've noticed has been completely left out of this discussion around toxic masculinity, that people in the chat are asking, you know, to what degree do women influence men's behavior? And I think it's something that is pretty understated. But I'm sorry to talk over you. I apologize. I'm not supposed to be involved, but I just wanted to ask about that because it's a question that I think a lot of people want to know the answer to. So,
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, like, of course, it's not like a very clear defined line between confidence and overconfidence, but it's absolutely something that can be like distinguished about in more of like a, you know, like when we're talking about characteristics and traits within individuals, it's most likely certain, like something that should be able to distinguish, you know, towards in the situations in which is it necessary, it is necessary. Now, the thing you talked about, women influencing men's traits, yeah, but once again, I would take that one step further. I would abstract it one step further. So what are the generalized social pressures that, you know, women are experiencing, and in what ways might the behaviors that are a product of those pressures influence men to do? So I would just take it one step further than what you provided with that specific analogy there, and that would fit just generally within a generalized discourse about gender roles and the way it intersects with society. But yeah, Prim should have. There was a question quite a bit ago that she has yet to answer, so I'm gonna stop talking for a minute.
It's fine. But see, I have a hard time like associating like behaviors specifically with one group or another. That again, I'm always focused on the individual lens. So I think more commonly, I suppose, that we see from men than women, I guess, is this kind of self-sacrificing, like in like the heroism sense, I guess. Like you see men going off to war to protect their loved ones. You see like men like jumping on bullets or jumping on grenades, oh my goodness, to protect their that would be something, wouldn't it? To protect all of the people around them. You saw photos of like men like jumping on women to protect them during the Las Vegas shooting, right? Just things like that. I think like that is more commonly seen in men traditionally.
Male disposability, right?
So,
To some
well,
extent.
yeah,
Yeah.
certainly but yeah, it's like, you know, there's this strong desire to want to like help and protect those around them. So it's I really think that if we focus more on the positive behaviors that both men and women do, I think we'll be coming at this from a more, you know, positive lens that more people will get on board with. But yeah, there's so much focus on the toxic parts that's not so
So
great.
there doesn't seem to
Anyway.
be. I mean, we could just wrap up and actually just move on, and then we can probably ask that at the end in the conclusion segment. So the next part, I think that was touched on pretty commonly that we can talk about is equality of opportunity. That was quite a common topic, and I can begin by defining it. And you know, thank you very much to you, Brian, for providing this beautiful definition of equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is the ability to maximize the potential of the individual to the degree that we can by essentially removing obstacles while allowing them the freedom to choose how hard they want to work, right? So by putting as many people as possible on as even a starting place as possible, and then trying to remove as many obstacles that we can in the way of them being able to, you know, work as hard as they can and demonstrate, you know, inner drive or work ethic or whatever it is that would determine your success within, you know, a given career path, for instance. And this is something that I'm very much in favor of, the general topic. One of the most common sort of rebuttals or questions I've been asked, both by people during a live stream and in a video response and in comments that I've received since then, is that how do you determine or how do you find out how to improve equality of opportunity without taking a look at equality of outcome. Those two things are necessarily linked, seems to be the implication there. And I would say that the outcomes and the statistics on the outcomes can be used in a lot of cases to infer or detect the existence of some forms of conflationary pressures on different social groups, but obviously shouldn't be acted on alone. So let's say we see that, for instance, there is a massive discrepancy between Group A and Group B in employment within the computing sector. Let's say the correct solution there from an equality of opportunity perspective wouldn't be, okay, heavy affirmative action, now let's fix this. The correct thing would be there, okay, it is likely here because let's say this discrepancy is way beyond like a regular margin of error, or, you know, like statistically significant. It seems that there may be some pressure here that is causing this discrepancy. Let's try to find out what that is and see if it's something that is possible or something that is worth amending. And that's how we can use information about people's outcomes in order to improve people's equality of opportunity. And yeah, I'm going to give it over to you.
Well, I mean, I think when you describe it that way, you know, it sounds great. Like, I think that if people were to like actually use that in practice, again, it could lead to positive outcomes. But I think again that a lot of the times it's not really used. It's not really used that way, right? Like, it's a lot of people are just kind of using it to be like, okay, well, this group is having negative outcomes, so therefore let's give them a whole bunch of additional benefits, even though, you know, it may not necessarily be because of that one specific thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think one of the big things with this whole discussion, well, actually, there's a couple of big things, but one of them is just that, you know, it can be tough to kind of nail down something like this and know for sure that like this specific thing is causing
Long-time
them
buddy, glad to see
to,
you've done
you
nothing
know,
but
fall
improve your
behind in
rhetoric and base of
outcomes as
knowledge.
compared to
Keep it up, you
other
legend.
people,
Hopefully get
right?
to talk to you
Like,
again.
Wait,
Sam
somebody
can
Frost
you
from the
give me
military
one
and
sec? I'm
socialism
really sorry.
convo.
There is some lady speaking in my ear that is preventing my audience from being able to hear you. Give me 1 second. I'm really sorry. I should have checked this beforehand. It was only for the last like 5 seconds.
Okay, like an advertisement or something.
It was for some reason I have text to speech enabled on some of these things here. There we go. Super chat. Okay. I'm terribly sorry. There we go. Disabled and save. All right. My bad. Feel free to restate whatever you were saying.
No worries. So yeah, basically I was saying, like, you can have two people that are from like the same, you know, group,
Mhm.
and they could have roughly the same number of things. They could have, I'm trying to oversimplify for the fact of being like expedient in the discussion, and I apologize about that. But basically these two people could have roughly the same amount of like general positives, negatives in their lives, but they could come out on like different things, right? Like, they could, one could go on to do nothing with their life, and the other could go on to do like amazing things with their life. And I you know, I don't want to keep bringing it back to the individual because I worry that that's coming across as obtuse. But I am just trying to say we have to be careful about using broad policies to make assumptions of people when that might not necessarily be the main thing that's causing difficulties. Like, for example, I think like a broad thing that could be helpful to lots of people are ensuring that we have healthy meals in schools for all children, right? Like, there are so many children that come from an impoverished background where they're just like, they're not getting proper nutrition, and like that is a major impact on their ability to learn and develop and grow, right? So being able to have a broad policy like that would help everybody across the board. I think something like that when I'm talking about like equality of opportunity, like that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, right? Like, trying to have policies that help the largest number of people, that try to, you know, the rising tide carries all boats, right? Like that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm saying that, is kind of looking at ways where people may be struggling and trying to find ways to help the like society as a whole. So that's kind of what I view as the equality of opportunity is just trying to focus on ways that can be done. Like people who have as much as Jeff Bezos, like that is like, I mean, I feel like I understand like why that is kind of just like we have an individual who's created something that, especially in the pandemic, many people are using more than almost anything else, right? So it's like I can get that, but I still think that like people having so much more than they need while other people are struggling is kind of an affront to a civilized society. But that's just me, I'm sure. But yeah,
Yeah, I can
kind
elaborate
of
on this.
hitting off and
So obviously,
kind of, yeah, kind of,
yeah,
sorry.
no worries. I agree with what you said with like raising all boats as much as possible, generalized policy, 100%. But at the same time, I think we can also recognize that there are different, that different groups of people also have specific ailments that they themselves are facing. So, for instance, one of the easiest examples, I think, and I think it should be easy to talk about this, is just a massive discrepancy in the quality of, let's say, for example, like education or wealth in Black families and the way that's affecting new generation of Black Americans, right? And we can see that there is such a incredible discrepancy between these two groups. Okay, why is this? So then we've done step one here. We've demonstrated a very much a strong difference in outcome. Okay, what's the next step? From there, we take a look at, okay, so let's try to detect these pressures that exist and see what they are and see if there's anything we can do about it. And if you look at that, we see that, there are an incredible amount of overwhelmingly Black communities that are severely underfunded when it comes to, for example, education. Black Americans, on account of something as, arbitrary as their name, for instance, are less likely to be able to secure a job due to the name that is on the interview. Their outcomes in a criminal justice system, which is the combination of certain biases which may exist within jurors, in combination with the fact that due to the worse socioeconomic condition of their parents, which predisposes them to have a poor socioeconomic condition, they may not be able to afford the same high quality lawyers, over policing in some districts, and all these different things. And a lot of the issues I laid out, while they definitely, I think Prim might be dropping the call.
Oh crap. Her internet is dropping, but she's back. She's back. All right.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. There was a big storm, so it's possible that could be impacting things.
Yeah. What did you
Prim, what was the last thing you heard him say?
I was just hearing like talking about like Black families, and we could look at the what's kind of causing that, the pressures that are causing them to have lower outcomes.
I can do it very briefly now, so that so chat doesn't need to hear it again. But yeah, so like specific pressures that they face may be on account of their name when it comes to employment, on account of biases that may exist within a jury in a criminal justice situation, and these are things that very specifically affect this given group, and specific action needs to be taken that is targeted towards that group at a greater extent than that is targeted, generally. Now, 100% that action will still help all boats and will still raise all boats. But looking at something that is like hyper generalized as just looking at equality opportunity through, for example, access to like lunches in schools overall can miss certain, difficulties and struggles that individual smaller social groups face specifically.
Yeah, that's I can get that, like going with like the Black families example. I know that like Black people do face more incarceration that for like say like marijuana crimes, for example, than white people. Like I know that that's a problem, and I think that that's a terrible thing. Like that's not something that should be happening. Like if we want to have legitimate justice, it should be applied evenly to everybody, no matter whether they're male, female, Black, white, whatever else, right? Like that is one thing that should absolutely be applied across the board, and it's frankly bullcrap that it's not. Another thing that I think also is that, like we've talked about this before on our show, right? Like there is kind of a problem in a lot of Black communities where unfortunately a lot of children are growing up in fatherless homes, and that is like having both parents in the household is a major predictor in people going on to be able to do well in their lives in a variety of ways. And so like, for example, there was a group that was like having a group of men going to schools in those communities where this was a common problem, and serving as like male mentors for the children there, so that they because a lot of those children will have to turn to, like, you know, maybe sometimes negative male mentors in not so savory manners. So having this kind of positive male mentor group was actually a big deal for helping a lot of them. Now, I think like that's a really great start. Also having ways to kind of, you know, like help promote like healthy family development and things like that in those communities could also be a really major thing. So yeah, like I can definitely agree with that. Like I'm not in disagreement with you that there are certain ways that we can kind of focus on groups that are
struggling,
demonstrating to behind in other groups, right? It's just the point at which it like stops being, okay, well, how are these people falling behind, and therefore, you know, going into, we have to have a certain number of people in these jobs, right, in order to have exact equality across the board. Because once we start getting into like that far realm, then we start kind of leaving things behind and being unrealistic about it. But the other things, you know, I think we're in full agreement with.
Yeah, like for example, like what you said, like when you do go like at the later step at the exact like same outcome in job, for example, and you do affirmative action, like for example, if you look at the affirmative action that's been taking place at universities, you can see that a lot of the cases, these failed miserably, right? Because what ended up happening is, okay, people ended up going to these universities and they were completely unprepared to study at that level and to be able to do that thing, so they end up dropping out. And that's what happens if you sort of like enter and try to repair inequities very late in the chain, is that you miss everything coming before that, and it's not going to be an effective policy. Basically, it's just not going to be effective. So you need to sort of like take some steps back and identify that. And the lack of fathers is absolutely one thing. There are some aspects of this problem that are overstated. I read a really interesting article recently about how when you look at like, you know, certain different aspects of statistics, so for example, the prevalence of having a father in the home that has done activity X with them, so has done homework with them, has, you know, like put them to bed, has made breakfast for them, and you look at those, that discrepancy is a lot less than that of just, you know, like the overall discrepancy that people tend to talk about. And also the fact that Black Americans tend to marry less per capita compared to white Americans also skew the statistics to some extent, and some of the effects and influences that have to do with your likelihood of getting married has to do a lot with class, so that's another thing that intersects there. So I agree with you, it's absolutely a problem. I just want to add a slight bit of nuance and maybe some further reading for the audience, because just to understand the problem a bit better. And when it comes to that issue specifically with the lack of fathers, 100% some systemic solutions to this could be, you know, taking a look at the drug war and the way that disproportionately affected Black communities and disproportionately affected men as well due to its connection to criminal activities. Taking a look at just general inequities within incarceration systems is absolutely one of the other things that can be beneficial in that regard. Taking a look at just overall class differences between Black and white people on average is another thing, because obviously there is a whole host of just negative social behavior that comes with being economically disadvantaged, and absolutely not having like a stable family life is most likely, or is definitely one of those. So yeah, I agree with what you said there as well, and just added a bit to it, really. Also, I want to say one thing. Badger Brian, I see you're writing a lot of stuff in the chat, and if you ever want to have a conversation, we can absolutely do that, because it seems like you have a lot more disagreements with me that you're dumping in the chat
Well,
for the moment.
I'm talking in the chat because I don't want to interrupt your conversation. But we can have you back on, because you can talk to Allison and you can talk to me, and we'll make sure that it's not like, you know, a gang up or whatever. Like we don't want to do that, right? So yeah, absolutely, I'll totally do it.
Yeah, talking to Prim is a pleasure. I think it would be fun to maybe talk to you and Allison at some point. I think that would be maybe, yeah.
And plus, I think, it's interesting because like doing it this way also allows us to kind of pick out the differences in my views versus my co-hosts, right? Because even though we're all like good friends and we all talk about men's issues and stuff like that, there are a lot of things that we don't fully agree on, and that's okay.
There seems to be a few from what I can get in the conversation so far. But yeah, so I just want to throw that out there because I see you talking shit in chat. Okay, just gonna call that out. Yeah, those were like the key.
It's not because I'm running. It's because I'm trying to be polite.
I know. I'm just letting you know, okay? Because some of the comments are they're a bit confrontational, but we'll make it work. I'm sure. Okay, I just wanted to point that out there. There was one more thing we can talk about, and once again, this may also be like a discrepancy between your opinions and the other people on that stream. The wealth gap between, or the earnings gap, or whatever, gender wage gap, gender earnings gap, or whatever. The response to that being brought up at the stream was, that's been debunked, and it was kind of like left at that. And I want to add some more, like I've done a lot of this, is add some more information, add some more nuance to that. Is that a direction that you would want to take this in a little bit? Is that fine with you?
Yeah,
Right,
that's
perfect.
fine.
I would like to start this.
Yeah,
by
we're trying to close. Oh, I'm sorry. We're gonna try and close this out at the end of the half-hour mark because Prim has she wants to go in the next 15 minutes ish. So you guys can have that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then we can do a conclusion, but I don't think this will take very long. First of all, what I want to say is that left-leaning people who say that no matter what job, women just get paid 20-30% less, you are completely wrong. That is incorrect, and you should be made fun of for that, okay? So I'm very clear saying that is not the argument that is going to be laid out here. What they typically talk about is the unadjusted wage gap between men and women, which can range typically anywhere from 20-30%, right? So this doesn't take into consideration hours worked, the type of jobs worked, time of amount of career, previous qualifications, and a million other things, right? There is an adjusted wage gap, which takes into consideration a whole much more of those different factors, and that one seems to range somewhere between 1% and 5%, which is still an issue, and we could talk about it, but it's nowhere near the overall 20-30% that is constantly thrown around. But nevertheless, I still think that there are some forms of negative pressures within society that is contributing to the 20-30% disparity that are worth talking about and are worth understanding and are worth, perhaps addressing in some form of way. From my reading on the topic, it seems like there is a number of different factors that cause the wage gap as it exists. It's number one, the fact that women-dominated jobs tend to typically pay less. It's point number two, that men and women tend to have a very different work culture. It's number three, that men and women tend to have very different approaches and expectations when it comes to child-rearing. And number four, it tends to be the case that there is a discrepancy in the work ethic perception of men and women as workers. So an excellent example to talk about the first one is that the women-dominated job. So while, there are some that are very, very intrinsically tied to maybe physical characteristics on the aggregate between men and women, such as, for example, construction labor, which is that's an inequity, right? That's a discrepancy in the outcome. There's a lot more men employed within construction than women. However, we see a discrepancy. We look, okay, what are the pressures for this? It's like inherent strength differences between this group of people. There's not much we can do about this, right? Unless we attach bionic arms to most women, it's going to be a bit of a difficulty to amend this, and it's not really something that's worth addressing. So that's fine. That's an example of. Mm-hmm.
It might be strength differences, but it might also be choices, right?
It could also be that.
I think a lot of people are kind of like, well, I don't want to go into construction work. I mean, I myself, I wound up going into like house painting for a time, painted my whole house. So like I worked with a male boss, with male coworkers and stuff like that. And, it was very much a culture of, I'm not going to take things easy on you. And I'm like, good, I don't want to be taken easy on. Right. So I think there can be a certain attitude that, like some people might not want to go into that, but hey, other people might, but I think on average, those are not like typically choices that,
and your strength might determine your choice, right? If you're less strong on average, you're probably not going to want to go into the job, as well.
It's
complicated. Surprise! That's like the conclusion of this entire discussion. It's complicated, But then there are also fields like, for example, computing, where there is such a massive discrepancy between the prevalence of women and men in these fields. And computing is, especially in today's day and age, a very highly paid job. And when people have run investigations and try to figure out what this is, a common factor that a lot of this research tends to point out on and to emphasize is the differences in how computers, just as an entertainment feature, as a study of science, was heavily gendered in the way it was presented to the public. If you look at advertisements for computers or video games or anything really technology related, there's like it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to find a single woman in those advertisements unless they're being used as a sex object in order to sell the product, right? And that's one of the largest factors contributing to the vast gender disparity. There is the way it's presented and the way society generally encourages these interests among different groups of people. And then this often reflects as that, okay, there's a lot of men here because of that originally, creates a subconscious bias that, hey, maybe this is a men's thing, and then people may subconsciously discriminate against women who may apply to those different fields or whatever. But that's the marginal side. I think that the previous one is more of the larger contributor to that. And that's an example that, hey, at the end of the day, right, any woman can choose to go into computing, right? So therefore you should just, if you adjust for that, then there's no discrepancy. But nevertheless, I think that this is something that should be addressed, right? Why should we socially encourage or discourage one group of people from engaging in one type of labor that is, in the situation, very, financially rewarding? And it's an example of that contributes to the wealth gap, and is something that, in my opinion, should be addressed, and that is harmful. So that's the event. Yeah, go for it.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think that like there are definitely egregious examples where, like some things are needlessly like gendered, or at least, certainly used to be. And like definitely much more than today. Like a close friend of mine just got her PhD in game studies and things like this. And so I have heard a lot about this kind of thing from her. But yeah, it's like, there are certain things that it needlessly shouldn't be, or it has been needlessly gendered in the past, and there's no reason for it to be. And like I'm very much about the personal choice thing, right? I think like if people want to go into this, then they should go into it because they have an interest in it, not because of like external pressures or because they think it's like just for boys or just for girls. I've always been very like,
opposed to that way of thinking.
Yeah, like I very much just like people to do what they do as long as it's not hurting others, basically. So one of the things that I have always gone against is that like people should challenge those kinds of barriers, right? Like people should go against that. Like if they want to get into something and there are those forces, well, then they should do it despite that, and like work within the culture around that. And I think that in most cases, the people who do that are, readily accepted. Like, for example, I wound up fitting in quite well into the culture that my painter boss had kind of established without saying, I can't reach this thing. So it's, I'm only 5'1", guys. So you got to help me out here.
Yeah.
And no, like he's like, just get a taller ladder. And it's like, okay, yep, let's do that.
Yeah, and this takes us back to the equality of opportunity thing, right? Removing as many like pressures that disincentivizes people from doing the things that they might have a genuine interest in.
Well, yeah, or I mean, like, just also it's very much about, not necessarily asking things to kind of like change to suit your needs, right? Like there's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I don't want to sound like I'm coming at it from one way or the other, but it's like, how can you kind of, hold respect for yourself in these cultures, and how can you also kind of try to, get around some of these needless gendering. Oh my goodness, I can't talk today. But yeah, I hope I'm making sense. You
Yeah, and
know, it's
what you just said, it takes us back to the difference between individual advice and sort of collective advice, right? Like trying to get people
yeah.
individually to work past them and trying socially on an aggregate to like reduce their influence and get rid of them as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's all coming down to the different lens, but I
Mhm.
think we're mostly in agreement.
Yeah. I can go through the last ones really, really quickly because I think we should do a conclusion as well. Work culture, basically, men typically are more encouraged and more valued in society on the basis of their ability to be career successful and financially successful, as compared to women who may, on an aggregate, be generally more valued or more encouraged, or just, yeah, typically more pushed in a direction of being more family oriented as a as a group of people. Now, obviously, individuals are very different, but on the average and the societal perspective tends to lean in this direction.
I think it's been like that a lot more like in the past, and I think
Mhm.
these days actually there's actually starting to become a lot of pressure in the other direction. Like I've seen people saying, you know, oh well, being a mother is going to impact your career, so maybe you should, you know, think about that.
Mhm.
And it's kind of funny how it's almost swinging in the other direction now, and
Mhm.
you know, you then have to wonder, it's like, you know, is this societal pressure to go in the other direction
Mhm.
positive, or is it harmful in another way,
Mhm.
right? Like I really wish that we could have just stayed in the area where it was like, you know, you can be a mom and that's great, or you
Mhm.
can be a career woman and that's great, or you can try and have it all and hopefully it's not too stressful for you.
Yeah. That's what we're aiming
But
for.
yeah,
We're aiming for the middle. We're aiming for like the elimination of as many pressures as possible. And that's another like men's issue that I think is should also be talked about more, is that we've seen such a general expansion and rollback on restrictive pressures in society on women for the past, few decades. And relative to that, men have not seen the same expansion of gender roles at all. So, for example, while today there's a lot more positive pressures towards women to become more career oriented, there have not been anywhere near the same pressures for men to be, family oriented and for that to be acceptable and to be a good choice of, for your life, for instance. So that's another, like men's issue that should absolutely be talked about and something I mention a lot. And the next one is sort of similar, right? Child rearing. Typically, societally, it's been expected that women should, take care of the children, or they should be the one that, abandons their career or takes time off from their career to raise the child. For a wide range of reasons. Also, there's been studies demonstrating that women with children are discriminated more in hiring than men with children, because the employer assumes that, okay, this children is going to affect the performance of this woman at my workplace more than that child is going to affect the performance of this man at my workplace. Therefore, I might take the man. And this is like studies, and like it's been empirically proven. So it's also like an abstract discussion to have there. And the final one, also more like study oriented, is the work ethic perception. People, and that includes employers obviously, generally perceive women as generally lacking compared to men in courage, leadership, and drive. And this might affect employment directly. And additionally, I'm sure you can explain this a million times better than me. Typically, when there's like a broad societal perception of a group of people, there are different pressures that cause that group of people to internalize those perceptions and lean in those directions, and sort of like appease these perceptions to some extent, whether consciously or subconsciously. And yeah, those are like the range of factors that contributes to the wealth gap. And a lot of these I feel like they're things we should do something about, because I find them to be like undesirable generally, and producing of negative outcomes.
fair enough. And I mean, like I think that I think that there are a lot of factors that influence that, absolutely. But I think we have to be careful about assuming certain things. Um, well, again, going back to the example I already provided about, like, you know, assuming that motherhood is holding people back rather than, you know, people just maybe have things that they want to do differently. Like I know that there was I can't remember exactly which country it was. I think it was like um, I think it might have been. I know it was one of the European countries where they were trying to focus on allowing for more freedom for men and women, and they actually wound up, you know, choosing going further into the gendered directions.
I
Like
think it
women
might have
would,
been East Russia, actually, in regards to STEM fields specifically, right? I think I remember hearing this. Uh,
um,
or maybe I'm thinking of something else.
all I remember is like that they were basically like given more leeway to do more things with their life, and there was this like gendered lifting of expectations of a lot of people, and despite that, it kind of went more gendered rather than less gendered. Like more women chose to stay at home and have families and things like that, and more men chose to go into high powered careers, and it's kind of like, at some point we have to ask the question. It's like, do we need to change this because like we see it as a problem, even though people in general might not be experiencing it as a problem? Or like, should it be more on us to, give as many people as possible the freedom?
Your mic cut out.
Oh, so it did. I accidentally whacked it.
Oh.
So I was just saying, like, giving more people the freedom to dictate their lives as they see free. So it's like, do we want to be like, we have to be careful with how we're applying like societal pressure, right? Because if we're not careful with where we're putting the pressure, we could wind up seeing the pendulum swing rather than the opening doors for more people to do what they want.
Yep.
So
It's not desirable.
complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can like wrap this up there. There doesn't seem to be any real major disagreement whatsoever in between the things that we want to see generally happen in society. I think that the biggest thing isn't a disagreement on anything substantive. It's just the differences that the lenses that we're looking at these issues from may have created some sparks like in between them. The difference between the collective and individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's just where we kind of have to be careful, right? Because if we're focused too much on one lens, then we might miss things from the other, right? So making sure to kind of try and have as broad a perspective on things as possible, and have conversations with people and see where we might be missing things is kind of the best way to go forward, in my view. So yeah, I think that is a good place to wrap up. Also, I just also wanted to say, like, I know that I said in my video that I'm going to kind of donate everything from this to that specifically it's to the new men's shelter that has opened in Canada, because that's the first shelter focused on men and families. But I just wanted to say, like, it really means a lot to me that you agreed to do the same. Like, it's really it's a really strong show of good faith that you were willing to do that. So I just wanted to, publicly say thank you and say kudos. I really appreciate that. And I think this whole thing turned into a positive as a result, despite some of the awkwardness along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't told, but this is a perfect opportunity to bring it up. But yeah, I think it's the right thing to do. So from my understanding, both me and Prim are going to donate the revenue that we've made for all the content relating to this entire back and forth, and it's going to men's charities to talk about and to solve issues that men face in society. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I guess I'll read my one super chat. I got one, and then we can wrap it up. So Egregious Charles gives us $10 and says, the point is that intersectionality treats everyone according to the aggregate. Many stereotypes are true in aggregate, but treating people according to them under the law is wrong. Thank you, Charles. Anyone want to respond to that at all, or?
I mean, yeah, policies aren't meant to treat individuals, right? They're meant to address broad social pressures. So obviously, if you look at like broad aggregates and just apply that to an individual's life in a given way, like maybe give all women X% just a donation of money, take away, like that's not going to make sense. It's not going to be productive. It's going to be completely worthless. But looking at those aggregate differences and taking a more broader, like society oriented perspective on it and trying to address those qualms, a lot more effective.
Yeah, and I think again it kind of boils down to the individual versus group perspective, right? It's like if we're not careful, some of these group policies can wind up missing things and causing problems at the individual level. So that's where we go, I think.
All right. So I want to once again, on behalf of HBR, thank Rose Rist for coming on and talking with Prim Reaper. And I do want to say thanks to both of you guys for helping out. This is a Justin Trottier project, the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. Thanks for helping out Justin with his men's shelter, and I think that that's quite fantastic. So no matter how this conversation turned out, it's a win for us because men benefited from that, which is good. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. We'll organize another time to bring Rose Wrist on to talk to Allison.
And you,
I
want to
think
speak to
that
you as well.
this will, yeah, but not at the same time.
Maybe,
I
who
don't
knows?
want to be. I don't want to. I mean, I'll moderate and everything, but I don't want to make it like a 2-on-1. I don't think that's fair. So, and I think that you and Allison will probably have a good conversation on. I won't be necessary. Okay, but we can talk after. We can do another one, and I'll talk to you. So,
All right, 3 debates, sure. Let's do it.
all right, cool. So we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up here. If you guys like this video, please hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, hit the bell for notifications, leave us a comment, and please share the video. Sharing is caring. We really appreciate it. We're close to 9,000 subs on the live streaming channel. Hope we can cross that Rubicon. I don't know if that's the word I would use, but into that new frontier of 9,000 plus subs. Please help us get there. Thank you guys so much for coming on today's episode of the Fireside Chat, and we'll talk to you guys in the next video. All right, it's over.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm still streaming on mine, just so you all are aware. But yeah, it was a good conversation, Prim. It was a lot more productive than I figured it would be. But yeah, I like the more the conversation that was like behind the scenes, the more I understand that. I think that there is less of a discrepancy or a strong disagreements between you and I, as much as there may have been between I and the other two people on that stream. So yeah, I look forward to having those conversations as well. I'm sure that's going to quench my the general chat's thirst for more aggressive engagements. But yeah, we'll see. I'm gonna go into it with as good of a faith as possible. Yeah.
I'm usually not very aggressive. It was just last time, and I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
This is a much more accurate portrayal of how I usually am.
No worries.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think that's all right.
All right.
All right.
I'm
Sounds
gonna
good.
take
I'm gonna
off.
get out of here. I gotta take the dog out. So I will be in touch, and I'll talk to Allison, and we'll work out another time. Okay.
All right. Bye bye.
All right.
Talk to you soon, Brian.
Bye.
Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Not a problem.